Forget the gilded ballrooms and the towering fortunes. This is a story about the single, forbidden spark that ignites when two worlds collide. In the rigid hierarchy of 1888 Boston, Miss Vivian Lyons is fighting to save her family's honor from ruin. But her fate is sealed the moment Alistair Thorne, the ruthless industrial baron, steps across her threshold, offering a fortune for her intellect. He needs a tutor. She needs salvation. Their arrangement quickly ignites a dangerous, exhilarating war of wills. She mocks his ambition. He challenges her pride. They are sworn adversaries, yet trapped by a desire that is too forbidden, too overwhelming to deny. When the line between contempt and passion shatters, how far will a man of fortune fall for the woman he hired to deceive society? Welcome to the heir's reckless masquerade. We want to know, what is the most irresistible kind of tension in a historical romance? Let us know in the comments below. Boston, Massachusetts, autumn 1888. The air in Boston was crisp, carrying the metallic scent of approaching winter and the heavy, intoxicating aroma of money being made. Yet, within the narrow confines of a respectable but decidedly aged townhouse on a quiet, gaslit side street, a different, more desperate tension reigned. This was the home of Miss Vivian Lyons, the last vestige of a once proud Brahmin family now struggling to keep afloat on the relentless tides of the Gilded Age. Vivian, aged 28, was seated at a mahogany desk that had belonged to her grandfather, a scholar of some repute. Her attire, a dark chalice dress in a shade of worn moss green, was meticulously neat, but the fabric bore the telltale signs of having been turned and remade several times. Her hair, a practical shade of chestnut, was pulled back in a severe, elegant coil that emphasized the sharp intelligence and underlying strain in her warm, deeply expressive brown eyes. She was not a woman whose beauty was fragile. It was the intense, formidable beauty of a classical statue carved by intellectual discipline. But at this moment, her formidable posture had begun to crumble. She stared at the official document, clutched between her hands. It was the final notice from the bank, cold and uncompromising, demanding immediate settlement or face foreclosure on the house, the very foundation of her family's honor. The sum, to her, was astronomical, a mere trifle to the titans building fortunes just blocks away. The shame was a bitter, suffocating weight. A sudden, sharp knock at the heavy oak door startled her, shattering the silence of her despair. It wasn't the discreet tap of a social caller. It was the firm, impatient rap of business. She opened the door herself, her spine instantly straightening into a defensive line. Standing on the marble step was a man whose expensive dark wool coat spoke of Fifth Avenue tailoring, not Boston tradition. Beside him stood a brisk, efficient-looking gentleman, clearly a secretary, holding a leather dispatch case. "Miss Lyons?" the secretary inquired, his tone flat. "We are here on behalf of Mr. Alistair Thorne." The name hit Vivian like a physical blow. Alistair Thorne, the industrial baron, the epitome of the new money that was swallowing her world whole, a man whose wealth was so vast it was almost mythological, and whose arrogance was legendary. The baron himself stepped forward, moving into the dim light of the hall. 33 years old, he was a figure of imposing power. His suit was dark charcoal, his collar high and unforgivingly starched. He possessed a strong, angular jaw and a pair of chillingly observant grey-blue eyes that seemed capable of stripping away a woman's illusions instantly. He didn't offer a bow or a pleasantry. He merely surveyed her. The air between them instantly thickened with antagonism. Vivian felt the profound, inescapable contrast, the baron radiating the harsh, clean power of industry and conquest, herself exuding the dignity and dusty refinement of a world dying under his relentless march. "Mr. Thorne requires a tutor," the secretary stated, cutting directly to the matter. Someone intimately familiar with the social mores and history of Boston's oldest families. Someone to guide his introduction to this city's more exclusive circles. Thorne finally spoke, his voice deep and carrying the unvarnished resonance of authority, devoid of the delicate inflections Vivian associated with old-world courtesy. "I require perfection, Miss Lyons, and I hear your mind is the finest instrument in this city." He paused, his gaze deliberately sweeping over her modest attire and the desperation she masked. "I will pay you a sum that exceeds what your father earned in a year. Enough to satisfy any outstanding debts." The audacity of the offer, the directness of his implied insult regarding her poverty, made a wave of hot fury rush to Vivian's cheeks. He had treated her like a commodity, her intellect a hired accessory. "Sir," Vivian replied, her voice low but perfectly steady, "my mind is not for sale, nor are my family's affairs up for public auction." Alistair's lips curved into a faint, challenging smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Everything is for sale, Miss Lyons. Even honor, when the price is high enough. You are in need. I am in need. Let us dispense with the poetry." He named the figure. The amount was dizzying. It was salvation. It was the only way to save the mahogany desk, the ancestral library, the name. The desperate necessity of the money eclipsed the searing insult of the transaction. She felt the heavy responsibility of her family's legacy settle upon her shoulders. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Vivian met his gaze with a defiant fire that made Alistair's own eyes narrow with unexpected interest. "Very well, Mr. Thorne," she pronounced, allowing only the slightest tremor of contempt to enter her voice. "I will accept your offer, but be warned. If you expect a gentle guide, you have mistaken my character. I will expose your deficiencies without mercy, and I will do so on my terms. I expect to be paid precisely as stated, or our agreement is void." Her words were not a plea, but a declaration of war. Alistair Thorne, the man of fortune, felt a flicker of grudging respect, and something far more dangerous. He had come expecting a grateful pauper. He had found a defiant queen. "I accept your terms, Miss Lyons," he said, the words a low promise. "The lessons begin tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Alistair permitted himself a final intense look at the woman standing stiffly in the shadowed hall. He knew he had bought her expertise, but he suddenly wondered if he hadn't just invited a highly intelligent and fiercely antagonistic serpent into the heart of his carefully constructed financial world. She had dared to mock him without saying a single mocking word, and the challenge was intoxicating. Vivian, meanwhile, shut the heavy door, her hand pressing against the wood. She had sold her time to the devil of industry, but she had saved her home. Now she would begin planning his inevitable and ruthless ridicule. Aqui está o capítulo 2, escrito no estilo intenso e dramático de romance clássico da Gilded Age, focando na escalada do conflito intelectual e na tensão emocional que leva à proposta da perigosa mascarada. The next morning arrived in a flurry of nervous energy and simmering resentment. Miss Vivian Lyons appeared precisely on time at the address Alistair Thorne had provided, a magnificent rented mansion on Beacon Street, where every marble surface and gilded moulding screamed of the nouveau riche's ambition to conquer Boston. Vivian was ushered into a vast library, a room attempting to project the gravitas of age, but failing, the leather-bound books having clearly been bought by the yard, not by the title. Alistair Thorne stood by the massive fireplace, looking utterly formidable in a waistcoat of deep sapphire blue, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating expectation. The stage was set for their first lesson, which Vivian instantly knew would not be a mere tutorial but a duel of wits. "Miss Lyons," Alistair began, his voice flat, "let us begin with the basics. My goal is simple. I must be indistinguishable from a man born to this city's highest social caste. I expect results and I expect discretion." Vivian did not sit. She stood opposite him, her hands folded primly but her eyes blazing with challenge. "Mr. Thorne, you ask for a transformation, not a tutoring. And transformation requires more than merely learning which fork to use. It requires understanding the spirit of Boston, which is built on lineage, not ledger books." She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze directly. "The Brahmins you wish to impress do not judge a man by the price of his coat, but by his knowledge of his own history, his respect for the classics, and his ability to hold a conversation that has nothing to do with railroads or steel. I will not teach you to imitate, I will teach you to understand, and you must be prepared for the process to be brutally honest." Alistair's formidable brow arched. "Brutal honesty, Miss Lyons? I assure you my world is built on it. Proceed." Thus began the mocking lessons, a daily ritual that quickly evolved from formal instruction into a series of cutting intellectual skirmishes. Vivian started with literature. She demanded he read obscure local poets and analyze the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, ridiculing his crude utilitarian interpretations. When he mispronounced a Latin phrase during a discussion of a Roman history, she pounced. "My dear Mr. Thorne," she remarked, her voice dripping with cool disdain, "that is precisely how a stable boy might announce his arrival. Your wealth, sir, may buy you an entire library, but it appears it cannot buy you a proper classical education." Alistair, unaccustomed to such sharp, personalized criticism, felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. His first impulse was to retaliate with a financial remark, to remind her of their respective circumstances. But the sight of the uncompromising fire in her brown eyes held him back. Instead, he forced himself to retaliate with the cold, hard logic of his own empire. "Your criticism is noted, Miss Lyons," he countered smoothly, "but I find your preoccupation with archaic pronunciation rather tedious. While I may struggle with the language of dead empires, I control the mechanisms of the future. My railroads feed your city, and my factories employ the men your esteemed Brahmins dismiss. Which precisely is the more valuable form of knowledge?" The debate raged for hours. Vivian accused him of sacrificing art for avarice. He accused her of clinging to a bankrupt idealism. It was in these heated exchanges, where their masks of formality slipped, that the intense, unsettling attraction first began to surface. Vivian found herself grudgingly respecting the sheer, undeniable power of his mind. He was not merely a brute with a checkbook, he was a strategic thinker who absorbed every lesson and every insult and used it to refine his attacks. He was the only man who had ever met her intellect with genuine force rather than bored condescension. Alistair, in turn, found himself utterly captivated by her. The polished society women he usually encountered were delicate, easily swayed, and entirely predictable. Vivian was a force of nature, a contradiction of rigid propriety and fierce independence. Her passion, usually reserved for old books and lost causes, now burned solely for the purpose of defeating him, and it was intoxicating. Every sharp critique, every mocking retort only deepened his admiration. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing day, charged by their mutual respect and disdain. One afternoon, the lesson involved the intricacies of attending a major gala. Vivian demonstrated a particular bow of deference required for a visiting dignitary. As she moved, her hand brushed his in a fleeting, unintended touch. The contact was brief, yet it was an electric jolt, a spark that immediately drew a harsh line under the purely intellectual nature of their warfare. They both withdrew instantly, a flush rising to their cheeks, the unspoken recognition of physical awareness hanging heavily between them. They continued the lesson, but the air remained charged, their words sharp, their proximity suddenly dangerous. The uneasy equilibrium of their arrangement shattered 3 weeks later. Alistair entered the library, his posture rigid with professional anxiety, his secretary trailing him with a look of extreme worry. "The lessons must change, Miss Lyons," Alistair announced, not requesting, but commanding. "The schedule is no longer sufficient. This morning I received correspondence from the Cabots. They are cautious. Vivian set down the copy of the scarlet letter she had been using to illustrate Bostonian hypocrisy. The Cabot family, the ones whose daughter you intend to marry to secure this merger? Precisely, Alistair bit out, pacing the Turkish carpet. They are suspicious of my lack of established Boston ties. They cannot risk joining their centuries-old name to a phantom. They are insisting that if I am to be admitted into their inner circle before the final merger, I must be accompanied by a reputable, impeccably bred, and socially unimpeachable female relation. Vivian's heart sank, a cold wave washing over the heat of their recent encounters. And what does this have to do with me, Mr. Thorne? I am your tutor, not your relative. Alistair stopped his pacing directly in front of her. His grey-blue eyes were narrowed, filled with a reckless, desperate cunning that was equal parts alarming and mesmerizing. It has everything to do with you, he stated, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. You possess the impeccable lineage, the impeccable manners, and the impeccable, if slightly outdated, wardrobe. You know the history, the names, the protocols. You are, quite simply, the most perfect counterfeit I could possibly purchase. Vivian blinked, horrified. Are you proposing? I am proposing a masquerade, he finished, the term sounding less like a social game and more like a high-stakes conspiracy. You will be introduced as Miss Vivian Vance, my distant cousin from a respected Virginia family who has come north to chaperone my entrance into society. It is the perfect narrative. A cousin from the South whose family name is unassailable, here to vouch for my integrity. No one will dare question a Cabot alliance that comes with such unimpeachable social pedigree. The very air seemed to vibrate with the sheer audacity of the fraud. No! Vivian recoiled, taking a step back. The prospect of using her family name, however disguised, for such a cynical deception was unthinkable. I am your employee, sir, not your puppet. My honor is all I have left. I will not engage in such an audacious, despicable lie. Alistair remained unmoved by her outrage. He knew exactly where to strike. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a thin, crisp banknote, the exact amount needed to settle her mortgage, plus double her current salary. He laid the note on the desk, pressing it under the corner of the heavy volume of Emerson. That is the immediate settlement of your mortgage, Miss Lyons, he said simply, his voice losing its demanding edge and becoming dangerously persuasive. The full title of your home saved, the disgrace averted. If you refuse me now, the entire sum is forfeited, and I will find another, less scrupulous actress. But no one will be as convincing as you, because no one is as genuinely a part of the world I need to enter. He leaned in, the raw power of his ambition washing over her. This masquerade is the only way to save your home and my fortune. We need each other, Vivian. I need your past to secure my future. You need my money to preserve your heritage. Vivian looked down at the paper. The amount represented the security she craved, the salvation that would allow her to hold her head high for the rest of her life, regardless of what the Baron did. The shame of being a tutor was nothing compared to the ignominy of being homeless, but the shame of being his fake relative, an imposter in the halls of her own society, felt almost unbearable. Her mind raced. If she agreed, she would have the power to mock him from the inside of his charade. She could force him to adhere to the rigid social standards she respected, making his journey even more agonizing. She would save her home, and she would save her pride by turning the tables, subtly mocking the Baron in front of the very society he sought to conquer. If I agree, Vivian said slowly, raising her gaze to his, you will ensure that my original house is safe, regardless of what happens to your merger or your fortune. I require absolute, documented proof of this first. It will be signed and sealed by my attorney this afternoon, Alistair promised, his eyes alight with triumph. And you will receive a secondary allowance for a proper wardrobe. You must look the part of a Virginia aristocrat. I will not be bought clothes by you, Vivian snapped, the last shred of her personal pride asserting itself. I will purchase what is necessary with the allowance, and this masquerade will be a partnership, Mr. Thorne. I am the brains of the operation. You will obey my instruction in all public matters, without question. Alistair paused, a flicker of genuine amusement crossing his austere features. It appears I am trading one form of servitude for another. Very well, Miss Vance. The contract is agreed. He extended his hand. It was a large, powerful hand, the hand of a man who built empires. Hesitantly, Vivian placed her own slender, cool fingers into his grasp. The handshake was firm, a formal sealing of the pact, yet the resulting jolt of intense, forbidden tension was undeniable. A physical current passing between two adversaries who had just been bound together by the most scandalous of lies. They stood, bound by a lie, united by desperation, and suddenly aware that their formal intellectual war was about to become a very real, very dangerous, and very intimate conspiracy. The contract of fraud was sealed, and the destinies of the industrial baron and the impoverished Bluestocking were irrevocably intertwined. The masquerade began with silk and artifice. The first week following the scandalous agreement was consumed by the creation of Miss Vivian Vance. Alistair had been true to his word, providing the necessary funds for a wardrobe worthy of a wealthy southern aristocrat, though Vivian insisted on choosing every fabric and design herself, maintaining a desperate grip on her professional dignity. She spent days with the finest dressmakers and milliners, the soft, rich textures of French lace and heavy velvet feeling alien against her practical hands. When she finally stood before a floor-length mirror in Alistair's Beacon Street mansion, the woman reflected back was a complete stranger. She wore a gown of rich, forest green satin, a colour chosen to complement the warm intensity of her eyes and the severe elegance of her coiled hair, which was now styled in softer waves around her temples. The dress possessed an elaborate drapery and bustle befitting the high fashion of 1888, adorned with delicate jet beading. The antique cameo, her only true family jewel, was replaced by a glittering necklace of borrowed diamonds that caught the gaslight with blinding arrogance. The transformation was absolute. The austere Bluestocking had vanished, replaced by a radiant, almost intimidating society belle. Alistair Thorne watched her descent down the sweeping staircase, and for the first time since their intense antagonistic introduction, his formidable composure faltered. He was accustomed to calculating assets, but the sight of Vivian, no, Miss Vance, was an experience beyond ledger books. She was magnificent, a perfect creature of their shared deception. His grey-blue eyes, usually sharp with calculation, softened, betraying a flicker of raw admiration that made Vivian's heart give a nervous, unfamiliar lurch. "You look—" Alistair paused, searching for a word that felt worthy of the spectacle. "Convincing. More than convincing, cousin." Vivian felt the heat of his gaze, a sensuality that was purely emotional, contained, yet potent. "The credit belongs to the couturier, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice carefully modulated to a softer, southern cadence. "I assure you, the moment this deception ends, I shall return to my plain merino." The evening of the first grand ball arrived, the event being a social cornerstone hosted by the powerful Cabot family, the very family Alistair was courting for the merger. The destination was a palatial brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, where carriages lined the streets for blocks and the sounds of a full orchestra spilled from the illuminated windows. As Alistair escorted Vivian up the marble steps, his hand resting lightly but firmly on the satin of her elbow, she felt the terrifying weight of the masquerade. This was not a theatre stage. This was the real battlefield of Boston society. Alistair, himself resplendent in pristine evening dress, whispered to her as they paused in the receiving line, "Remember your history, cousin, and remember your contempt. It makes you dazzling." They were presented to Mr. and Mrs. Cabot, and then, crucially, to Miss Eleanor Cabot, the refined, coolly beautiful heiress Alistair was expected to wed. Vivian played the part flawlessly, offering soft, charming platitudes, while her mind worked with ruthless speed, cataloguing the subtle nuances of Eleanor's reserved nature. The ballroom was a shimmering vortex of wealth. Vivian quickly realized the extent of Alistair's social vulnerability. He was powerful, yes, but he was treated with a cautious distance, an object of necessary commerce rather than welcome friendship. Vivian, however, was an immediate triumph. She was an unexpected variable, an exotic bloom in the rigid Boston garden. Men sought her out for dances, captivated by her beauty and her unfamiliar pedigree. Yet, it was when she spoke that she truly shone. She used her deep, lifelong knowledge of history, literature, and social protocol not to merely participate, but to mock the elite with sophisticated elegance. When a certain financier boasted of his influence over the city's recent infrastructure plan, Vivian commented, with an air of wide-eyed innocence, on the historical precedent for new emperors attempting to leave their mark on the aqueducts of their conquered cities. When a dowager spoke condescendingly of southern families, Vivian recalled a charming, apocryphal tale about the dowager's own family history that subtly highlighted their ancestors' own humble, perhaps scandalous, beginnings. Alistair watched her throughout the evening with a mounting, dangerous pride. She wasn't just convincing, she was subversive. She was the only person in the room who truly saw the sham, and she dared to expose it with a velvet knife. The passion he felt for her mind was quickly transforming into something deeper, more protective, and acutely possessive. He noticed every glance directed her way, feeling a strange surge of jealousy that his cousin was the object of such public admiration. But the night held a dark undercurrent. Mr. Harrington, Alistair's primary rival in finance, and a man known for his meticulous, icy persistence, began to observe the pair with unnerving focus. Harrington was the kind of man whose ambition was silent, masked by a deceptively mild demeanor. Harrington approached Alistair with chilling politeness. "Your cousin, Mr. Thorne, is a captivating beauty. I confess, I was unaware of a Vance branch in your immediate family tree. Such a dazzling entrance is usually preceded by much social maneuvering." Alistair felt the defensive heat rise. He placed a hand on Vivian's waist, a gesture he instantly regretted for its possessiveness, and offered a dismissive explanation about the Vance family's penchant for quiet, scholarly pursuits. Harrington did not press, but his pale, calculating eyes lingered on Vivian's face for a moment too long. "She possesses an extraordinary intellect, quite beyond the usual frivolous preoccupations of a society lady," he remarked. "She spoke to me of Roman history with the precision of a scholar. I must confess, I should like to know more about the foundation of her education." The comment was subtle, but Vivian recognized the latent threat. A genuine Southern belle would be expected to possess charm, not the precise, detailed knowledge of a Boston Bluestocking. Harrington had sensed an inconsistency, a crack in the polished veneer of their story. The pressure had intensified, their performance had to be flawless. As the grand event finally wound down in the early hours of the morning, Alistair and Vivian managed to slip away, their nerves frayed and their minds exhausted by the continuous performance. The tension between them was palpable as their carriage pulled away from the glittering avenue. The silence in the confined space was thick, weighted by the champagne, the lies, and the shared danger. Vivian, utterly drained, leaned her head against the cool velvet of the seat, the diamond necklace feeling suddenly heavy and oppressive. "We survived," Vivian whispered, the relief making her sound fragile, suddenly just Vivian Lyons again, not the magnificent Miss Vance. "Harrington noticed the gaps, Alistair. He knows I am too knowledgeable." Alistair, who had been staring out the window, turned. The gaslight from a passing street lamp illuminated his face, revealing a profound mix of relief and intense focus. He reached out slowly, tentatively, his large hand moving toward her. He didn't touch her face or her shoulder. He reached for the hand that was resting on the satin seat cushion. His strong fingers closed gently around her wrist, finding the pulse point beneath her thin glove. It was a gesture of immediate, non-erotic intimacy, a financier checking the vital sign of his most crucial investment, a man checking the beat of a heart that was now inextricably tied to his own deception. "I know he did," Alistair admitted, his voice a rough murmur. "But I watched you, Vivian. You were brilliant. You are the only person who can navigate this world for me." His thumb, still on her wrist, moved in a slow, almost unconscious circle. The touch was simple, yet it sent a searing electric shock straight up Vivian's arm, overriding the fatigue and the fear. The sheer masculinity of his touch, combined with the soft vulnerability in his voice, dissolved the boundary of tutor and employer. It was the touch of a co-conspirator, a man who recognized her power and was asking, in that small, possessive contact, for her continued loyalty. They were no longer acting. The line between the performance and the reality had shattered. In the close, dark confines of the carriage, united by the secrets and the shared peril, they were simply Alistair and Vivian, two desperate souls, whose fierce antagonism had given way to a terrifying, undeniable, and deeply forbidden passion. They sat motionless, the simple touch on her wrist being the only measure of the overwhelming desire that had just been ignited in the heart of the Gilded Age deception. The singular charged touch in the carriage following the cabaret ball became the new unspoken dimension of their relationship. The intellectual warfare continued, but it was now merely a pretext, a thin veneer of professionalism concealing a turbulent, rapidly escalating desire. The formal lessons resumed, yet every shared glance, every accidental proximity was fraught with the memory of that electric contact. Days bled into a rigorous schedule of social obligations and clandestine instruction. As Miss Vivian Vance, Vivian was forced to accompany Alistair Thorne everywhere, from exclusive tea parties, where she brilliantly deflected the scrutiny of the matrons, to high-stakes dinners, where Alistair used her presence as social proof of his bona fides. It was during a carriage ride to the docks that Alistair unexpectedly diverted their course. "Our lesson today will not be found in any history book, Miss Lyons," he announced, his gaze fixed on the crowded streets, giving way to the sprawling, noisy periphery of the city. "You accuse me of lacking understanding. I intend to remedy that by showing you the world I actually govern." He led her, not to a glittering office, but deep into the labyrinthine heart of his railway freight yard. The air here was heavy with the smell of coal smoke, oil, and the sweat of labor. Great steam engines shrieked and hissed, monstrous symbols of the industrial age. The scale of the operation was staggering, a living, breathing testament to Alistair's raw power. Vivian, dressed in a fashionable walking suit, felt profoundly out of place. She looked at the grimy, weary faces of the workers, the sheer, unrelenting force required to move mountains of iron and goods. It was a world utterly foreign to her gentle libraries and drawing rooms. Alistair, meanwhile, was entirely at home. He shed the rigid formality of the Bostonian gentleman. His voice, speaking to a foreman, was sharp, clear and commanding, yet infused with a deep, practical knowledge of every machine and process. Vivian saw a man utterly stripped of artifice. This was not the arrogant suitor. This was the engineer, the strategist, the creator. He spoke of the thousands of lives dependent on the precision of his timing, the weight of the responsibility for the city's commerce resting on his shoulders. "You despise the wealth, Vivian," Alistair said, using her true name for the first time outside the confines of their private library, the sound of it intimate and forbidden amidst the din of industry. "But this wealth is not merely lace and idle hours, it is the framework of the future. The pressure you feel to save one small house. I feel that pressure, magnified 1,000-fold, to save an entire empire. And I assure you, my ambition is born of the need to never be powerless again." Vivian looked at his face, streaked faintly with soot. His grey-blue eyes narrowed against the harsh light, yet filled with a vulnerability she had never anticipated. She saw the man, not the title. His drive was not fueled by greed alone, but by a visceral fear of failure. The same fear that drove her. In that moment, her contempt for him fractured, replaced by a devastating, empathetic recognition of a kindred spirit fighting their own unique battle for survival. The forced intimacy of the following week continued to press them together, slowly eroding the walls of their professional pretense. They were seen everywhere as the devoted intellectual cousins, their connection a subject of hushed admiration. Late one evening, they returned from a performance at the opera. The house was silent, and the clock chimed midnight. They paused in the grand hall, the polished marble floor reflecting their exhausted images. "You were exceptional tonight, Vivian," Alistair murmured, his voice husky. "You handled the questions from Mrs. Vandermeer about the southern estates with brilliant subtlety. You averted a disaster." "It was merely history, Mr. Thorne," she replied, suddenly breathless, "and theatre." "No," he insisted, taking a slow step toward her, closing the necessary professional distance. "It was courage and brilliance." He reached out, not in command, but in appeal. His hand found the delicate curve of her shoulder, resting lightly against the silk of her evening gown. His thumb moved subtly, tracing the line of her collarbone. The air was thick with unspoken longing, a potent mixture of the opera's romantic tragedy and their own highly flammable predicament. Vivian lifted her gaze, her warm brown eyes wide and unguarded. The tension, held captive for weeks, snapped. Alistair lowered his head, his mouth finding hers with a ferocity that contradicted his usual control. The kiss was not tender but demanding, a desperate acknowledgement of the lie they were living and the truth they could no longer deny. It was a chaotic clash of two powerful wills that had finally succumbed to the inevitable. Vivian clung to the lapels of his coat, the expensive wool ruff beneath her fingertips, responding with an intensity that shocked them both. For one fleeting, forbidden moment, there were no mergers, no mortgages, no society, only the exquisite, dangerous relief of raw, realized passion. They broke apart, breathing heavily, the shame and the thrill instantly replacing the desperation. "We must not," Vivian choked out, her entire body trembling. "We must not," Alistair echoed, his eyes dark with residual desire. He straightened his coat, reassembling his composure like a fallen fortress. The guilt was immediate and heavy. It was the next afternoon that the delicate balance of their secret was utterly destroyed. Vivian was searching the library for a copy of the obscure parliamentary law Alistair needed for a quick study session. She was directed to a secondary desk, usually locked, where Alistair's personal sensitive papers were kept. The key had been carelessly left in the lock. Driven by a sudden irresistible impulse that she later attributed to fate, Vivian opened the drawer. She found no parliamentary law, but rather a thick, official-looking document bound in a solicitor's red ribbon. The title, boldly written across the top, read, "Agreement for Matrimonial and Financial Union, Thorne and Cabot Estates." Vivian pulled out the contract, her hands shaking violently. It was the formal engagement agreement between Alistair Thorne and Eleanor Cabot. Her eyes scanned the document, moving past the cold financial terms to the crucial signature lines. Alistair's signature was there, bold and unyielding. The date beside it was equally clear. It had been signed 2 months prior, weeks before he had hired Vivian as a tutor, and long before he had proposed the entire cousin masquerade. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and numb. The realization was a devastating physical blow. He hadn't hired her simply to become suitable. He had hired her to act as his social shield, while his true commitment, his commitment to the Cabot fortune, was already secured. Her vulnerability, her intellect, her very person, had been used as a strategic tool to distract, to authenticate, to polish the lie that was already a done deal. The kiss, the shared vulnerability at the freight yard, the promise of respect. It was all a cruel manipulation. When Alistair returned, he found Vivian standing in the center of the library, the damning contract held loosely in her trembling hands. The fierce intelligence in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, shattering wound. "Explain this," Vivian commanded, the two words sharp and dangerous tearing through the silence. Alistair froze, his face losing all color as he recognized the document. The moment he had dreaded had arrived. "Vivian, please," he began, taking a cautious step forward. "It isn't what it looks like." "Is it not?" she challenged, her voice rising in raw, emotional agony. "It looks, Mr. Thorne, like the truth. You signed this 2 months ago. You used me, my honor, my desperation to save my home, to validate a lie that was already sealed. The engagement was a done deal, and I was merely the convincing actress hired to perform the prologue. The kiss, your confidences, were those part of the performance too." She threw the document onto the expensive carpet, the paper scattering like shattered trust. "You are a fraud, sir. A despicable man who uses people like currency. You bought my silence, but you cannot buy my soul." Alistair stood his ground, letting her fury wash over him. His ambition had just cost him the one thing he could not purchase. "It was a mistake to hide it, I admit," Alistair said, his voice low, heavy with guilt and remorse. "But the contract was signed under intense pressure." "Pressure from what, Alistair?" Vivian demanded, using his first name with a scorn that was infinitely more devastating than any formal title. "Pressure from your insatiable greed." "No! Pressure from the past, from the necessity of keeping my company afloat. The contract is only business, Vivian. Cold figures. The truth is what happened in that carriage. The truth is that I fell in love with the only woman in Boston who sees me as a man, not a balance sheet. I fell in love with the woman who dares to mock me. I never intended for this to happen, but I swear to you, the business contract means nothing to me now. You are real. We are real." The confession hung in the air, desperate, immediate, and utterly sincere. Vivian felt the powerful tug of his words battling against the harsh reality of the signed contract. She wanted to believe him, but the evidence of his betrayal was lying right at her feet. She looked at the contract, then back at Alistair, his powerful frame trembling slightly, his vulnerability an unexpected sight. The attraction between them was now an agonizing, profound conflict. She was faced with the most devastating choice: to flee the betrayer, or to remain with the man whose powerful love confession, however belated, was shattering her carefully constructed world. The trust was gone, but the love was undeniably there, raw and aching, a new and terrible burden on her heart. The devastating confrontation in the library had left the relationship between Alistair Thorne and Vivian Lyons irrevocably altered. Trust, the foundation of any enduring alliance, had been smashed, but in its place a powerful, hazardous need had emerged. Vivian was wounded by his calculated deceit, yet haunted by the raw desperation and sincerity in his belated confession of love. Alistair, knowing he could not retract the signed contract, faced the agonizing task of proving the truth of his heart while maintaining the lie of his life. The pressure intensified immediately. Mr. Harrington, the meticulous rival, had become a viper at their heels. He made his skepticism public, not through outright accusation, but through pointed inquiries whispered across Boston's drawing rooms. He questioned Alistair's lack of intimate knowledge regarding the supposed Vance family estate in Virginia, and even subtly suggested to the Cabot family that an inquiry be made into the historical records of the distant cousin. The stakes became frighteningly high. Alistair was convinced Harrington was deliberately stalling the merger with this social scrutiny, hoping to buy time to undermine Thorne's railway interests. To counter Harrington's maneuvers, Alistair was forced to accept a seemingly innocent invitation from the Cabot patriarch, a small, formal gathering meant to finalize the last details of the merger and celebrate the imminent engagement to Miss Eleanor Cabot. The pressure on Vivian to be flawless was absolute. Any inconsistency would mean not only the exposure of their deceit, but the ruin of Alistair's company and the likely public humiliation of the entire Cabot line. The evening was held in the Cabot's stately, oppressive dining room, the silence of the polished silver and stiff manners more frightening than the chaos of Alistair's factory floor. Vivian, arrayed in a gown of midnight blue that emphasized her pale tension, sat rigidly opposite Alistair. The conversation revolved around property and lineage, topics Vivian usually handled with ease. However, when Mrs. Cabot asked a seemingly benign question regarding the precise date of her family's arrival in the South, Vivian's mind seized up. She was an expert on Boston history, not Virginian genealogy. The specific date required a detail she had not memorized. A moment of chilling, utter silence fell over the table. Vivian's warm brown eyes flickered with panic. She offered a vague answer, hoping the social nicety of her delivery would smooth over the lack of precision. But the silence stretched, and Vivian felt Mr. Harrington's pale, calculating gaze settle on her. He smiled slowly, a cruel, cold expression that meant only victory. "Indeed, Miss Vance," Harrington drawled, his voice carrying clearly. "It is a peculiar thing for a member of such a distinguished line to be vague about the foundational year. One would think such a date would be etched into the very stones of the manor." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. She was exposed. Before she could form a desperate, flimsy excuse, Alistair intervened. He spoke with the speed and sharp authority of a man closing a complex financial deal, but his words were an improvised social lie. "My cousin speaks of the second settlement, Mr. Harrington," Alistair cut in, his grey-blue eyes instantly locking onto the rivals. "The first manor, you see, was completely destroyed in the great fires of the early 1800s, a tragedy that involved a catastrophic loss of documents. The family speaks little of it. It is a sensitive subject. They re-established themselves with the second settlement. A distinction, I assure you, that a true historian like my cousin would never confuse." The quickness, the sheer force of his invention was breathtaking. Alistair had not only covered her error, but had turned the vulnerability into a point of refined, aristocratic sensitivity. Mrs. Cabot immediately jumped to Vivian's defense, condemning Harrington's lack of tact. Alistair had saved her. He had risked the entire merger by interrupting the Cabot's flow, proving his loyalty lay, at that moment, entirely with protecting her facade. The dinner concluded without further disaster, but the strain was immense. Alistair and Vivian departed immediately, the air thick with the unspoken recognition of the near-fatal slip. They settled into the silent carriage for the short journey back to Beacon Street. Vivian was exhausted, leaning her head back, her breathing shallow. She wore the expensive clothes of a perfect lady, yet felt the internal trembling of a terrified child. Alistair, watching her exhaustion, felt the raw, brutal weight of his impending financial sacrifice. He knew the cost of his public choice would be devastating, but the sight of her nearly collapsing under the pressure of his lie solidified his decision. He couldn't subject her to this deceit any longer. "I cannot do this to you anymore, Vivian," Alistair confessed, his voice rough, stripped of all its former arrogance and command. "I cannot watch you break under the pressure of a lie I forced upon you." He reached for her hand, his large, powerful fingers gently enclosing hers. This touch was no longer about deception or intellectual warfare. It was about raw, exposed need. "I know you saw the contract," he continued, his grey-blue eyes searching hers in the dim light of the carriage lamp. "I know the signing date condemns me. But I swear to you, I would rather face bankruptcy than stand next to Eleanor Cabot at the altar. I would rather lose the entire Thorne empire than lose the truth I found in you." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a fleeting kiss to her gloved knuckles. "The man who signed that paper was a desperate fool, trapped by the ambition of his own making. The man speaking to you now is the man you mocked, the man you forced to look at the world differently. And he loves you, Vivian. Not Miss Vance, the perfect Virginian accessory, but the Bluestocking, the woman who dares to call me a brute and forces me to prove otherwise. The thought of marrying Eleanor suffocates me. You, my furious, brilliant adversary, are the only air I can breathe. His confession was desperate, immediate, and utterly sincere, tearing through the last vestiges of her defenses. Vivian searched his face, seeing the unmistakable fear and vulnerability that confirmed his words. He was terrified, and his fear was for her, not for his ledger books. The exhaustion of the masquerade, the terrifying rush of the near exposure, and the emotional power of his raw declaration combined into a devastating emotional cocktail. The intense passion they had previously denied now rushed in to fill the void left by their shattered trust. Vivian leaned into him, the decision made not by logic, but by a powerful, unavoidable yearning. Her hand rose, tentatively tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice husky with suppressed emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust your name, but I believe your fear." It was the only absolution she could offer. The carriage seemed to shrink around them. Alistair needed no further invitation. He swept her into an embrace, a desperate, powerful joining of two souls who had finally admitted their fate. Their kiss was profound, a surrender, a final acknowledgement that their intense, agonizing conflict had always been leading to this moment. The desire, so long contained by the rules of propriety and the necessity of their lie, broke free. They knew they were racing toward the brink of disaster. The public engagement was imminent, their secrets were exposed to a dangerous rival, and the entire structure of their lives was unstable. They arrived back at the mansion, but neither was ready to part. In a shared, silent decision to claim this one final moment of truth before the coming storm, Alistair led Vivian not to her temporary suite, but into the shadowy silence of the conservatory, a space filled with the lush, humid air of exotic, uncivilized blooms. They shared a passionate, intense intimacy that night, a profound emotional and physical union born of rebellion and necessity. It was an act of desperate courage, a final, reckless moment of truth, shared by two people who knew that when the sun rose, they might lose everything. They claimed each other completely, sealing their secret with the fervent, desperate knowledge that this might be their only night, their only memory before the rigid, unforgiving world of the Gilded Age tore them apart forever. The future was terrifyingly uncertain, but the reality of their love, forged in the heat of deception, was gloriously, undeniably real. The fragile, reckless intensity of the night in the conservatory was immediately besieged by the brutal light of day. Alistair Thorne and Vivian Lyons had crossed a line, their shared passion a desperate plea against the unforgiving reality of their respective worlds. Yet they had to face that reality, knowing that the final decisive social event was upon them, the Cabot's dinner where the final terms of the merger were to be concluded. The atmosphere in the mansion was taut, stretched to the breaking point. Vivian, pale but resolute, dressed herself in the last of her borrowed finery, a gown of shimmering, unforgiving crimson. She wore the color not as a symbol of passion, but as a defiant banner of warning. She knew the dinner was a pretense for the official announcement, and she knew that Alistair, despite his fervent words, would still stand beside Eleanor Cabot to finalize his business deal. As they were ushered into the Cabot's ballroom, Vivian felt the suffocating weight of the Gilded Age closing in. The room was packed with Boston's most powerful figures, their faces a collective tapestry of curiosity and judgment. Alistair's hand rested on Vivian's lower back, an intimate, possessive gesture that felt desperately real, yet utterly false, given the circumstances. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Just tonight, Vivian. Keep your gaze high. We will speak tomorrow, and I will find a way to end this." His promise sounded hollow, weak against the roar of ambition surrounding them. The dinner proceeded with excruciating formality. Mr. Cabot, a man whose face was etched with the grim responsibility of old money, rose from the head of the long, heavily laden table, tapping his champagne glass for attention. A profound silence descended upon the room. "Friends, esteemed colleagues," Cabot began, his voice resonating with patriarchal authority, "we have concluded the final negotiations that will unite the powerful Thorne interests with the venerable strength of our family. This union, of course, is symbolized by a far more personal and cherished bond." He raised his glass, his eyes beaming toward his cold, elegant daughter, Eleanor. "It is my distinct honor to announce the formal engagement of my daughter, Miss Eleanor Cabot, to Mr. Alistair Thorne." The room erupted in applause. The announcement, though expected by all, struck Vivian with the force of a physical betrayal. The sound of the celebration, the tinkling of glasses, the murmur of well-wishes, became a distant, mocking echo. The desperate, honest words Alistair had whispered in the dark conservatory dissolved into the cold, hard currency of social acceptance. Vivian froze, the crimson of her gown feeling suddenly like a mark of shame. Her warm brown eyes lifted automatically, seeking out the man who had just claimed to love her while publicly claiming another. Alistair Thorne was standing, accepting the congratulations of the men nearest him. He looked formidable, successful, and utterly miserable. His grey-blue eyes, haunted and desperate, found hers across the distance of the glittering table. In that single, agonizing moment, their shared secret, their shared passion, the risk, the betrayal, flashed between them. Vivian saw the intense remorse in his gaze, but it was overshadowed by the undeniable reality. He had chosen the empire. He had chosen to stand by the signature on the pre-signed contract. The truth, however beautiful, had lost to the financial demands of the Gilded Age. A single, searing thought consumed Vivian. He is a liar. The mockery was real, but the love was just another calculation. The scene was set for disaster. Mr. Harrington moved with the lethal precision of a hawk. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment of Alistair's triumph, to deliver his fatal blow. He raised his voice above the murmurs, directing his words with calculated precision toward Mr. Cabot. "A toast, Mr. Cabot, to the happy couple. But before we drink, perhaps a toast to the cousin who made it all possible." Harrington's voice was laced with poison. "A cousin, I must confess, whose impeccable lineage I found impossible to verify." A chilling hush fell over the room. Every eye snapped toward Vivian. Alistair, sensing the imminent catastrophe, took a sudden, frantic step toward her. Harrington did not hesitate. He pulled a rolled document from his coat pocket, a document obtained through weeks of bribery and ruthless investigation. "I found no records for Miss Vivian Vance in Virginia," Harrington announced, his voice ringing with malicious satisfaction. "But I did find a record here in Boston, listed under a very different name, in the employ of the now-deceased Mr. Charlesworth, a young woman of exceptional intellectual gifts but rather humble means." Harrington unfurled the paper, his smile triumphant. "I give you, ladies and gentlemen, not the noble Miss Vance, but Miss Vivian Lyons, a mere governess." The ensuing silence was catastrophic. It was the sound of an entire social structure collapsing. Gasps rippled through the room. The initial shock gave way to waves of murmurs, outrage, and horrified recognition. A scandal of this magnitude was unheard of. A commoner introduced as a social elite to manipulate the most powerful merger in Boston. Vivian stood paralyzed, the object of 100 cruel, judging eyes. The wealthy women who had admired her gown and wit now viewed her with undisguised contempt. The powerful men who had courted her suddenly saw only the dirt beneath their polished shoes. She felt not anger, but a profound, sickening humiliation that burned hotter than any fever. Her name, her dignity, and her last shreds of honor were being shredded publicly. Alistair lunged forward, shouting, "Harrington, you bastard, this is libel!" But the damage was done. Mr. Cabot's face was dark with outrage. Eleanor Cabot stared at Vivian with cold, aristocratic fury. Seeing his company's success and his social standing evaporate, Alistair turned to Vivian, his face contorted with a desperate mixture of panic and love. He reached out to grab her hand, intending to stand by her, to defend her against the torrent of judgment. But Vivian was beyond saving. The betrayal of his engagement, followed by the public exposure, was too much. She saw his move not as a defense, but as a final possessive clutch from the man who had used her to save his empire. She recoiled violently, snatching her hand away from his touch. "Don't you dare touch me," she whispered, the raw agony in her voice tearing through the chaos. With the last remnants of her strength, Vivian turned and fled. She didn't pause for her coat or her dignity. She simply ran, the long crimson skirts of her deceptive gown billowing behind her. She pushed past servants, past horrified guests, and burst out of the Cabot's mansion into the cold, gaslit night. She was no longer the sophisticated Miss Vance. She was Vivian Lyons, the disgraced woman of humble means, who had been foolish enough to mock and then love the man of fortune. She ran blindly, escaping the ballroom, the lies, and the crushing realization that she had lost everything. The respect of her city, her carefully guarded honor, and the heart she had foolishly given to the industrial baron. The shame was absolute, the emotional trauma irreversible. The night that followed the unmasking was a blur of chaos and recrimination. For Vivian Lyons, stumbling back to her quiet, familiar street, the only solace was the heavy, comforting presence of her ancestral home. She tore off the deceitful crimson gown, the fabric now feeling like a shroud of shame, and sought refuge in the familiar austerity of her library. Her mind was a tormented landscape of humiliation, fury, and the desolate ache of misplaced love. She had sold her time for security. She had accidentally traded her heart for betrayal. She sat at her desk, driven by a deep need to cleanse her soul of the baron's manipulation. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began to write Alistair Thorne a letter, not of forgiveness, but of finality. It was a document of pure, intellectual scorn, dissecting his character, his greed, and the ultimate lie that was their affair. She concluded with a statement of chilling clarity. "I may have lost my reputation, but I retain my honor. It is the one treasure your fortune can never purchase or corrupt." She sealed the letter, intending to send it at dawn, then prepare to flee Boston forever. Meanwhile, in the glittering mansion on Beacon Street, Alistair Thorne was enduring the darkest night of his ambitious life. The fallout from the dinner was instantaneous and brutal. Financial telegrams flashed across the wires, demanding answers. The Cabots, mortified by the public scandal, had issued an ultimatum. Alistair had exactly 24 hours to publicly denounce Miss Vivian Lyons as a pathological liar and a common opportunist, apologize for the deception, and sign the final binding merger documents, or face a total severing of all ties. The loss would not just be the merger. It would be a crippling public vote of no confidence that could lead to the forced liquidation of his railway interests. Alistair sat alone, the weight of his failing empire pressing down on him. His ambition, once his greatest strength, was now his most potent enemy. Yet, as he stared into the cold fireplace, he did not see the balance sheets. He saw Vivian's face, etched with despair as she ran from the ballroom. He saw the genuine, searing fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored the terror he had known in his own youth. He realized that if he denounced her, he would save his fortune, but commit a moral murder. He would destroy the only person who had ever truly seen past his title. He thought of the money he had promised her to save her home. That promise, at least, could not be broken. Driven by a sudden, fierce necessity, Alistair called for his private solicitor. In a rapid, decisive act of financial maneuvering, a final, cunning move of the Baron, he ordered the immediate and complete liquidation of Vivian's mortgage. He ensured that a large, substantial sum was quietly and untraceably transferred to her name, protected in an anonymous trust, money that would guarantee her independence and safety, regardless of the coming financial storm. He did this before making the final choice that would risk his own financial ruin. He protected her legacy first. The sun was barely above the horizon when Alistair arrived at Vivian's humble, proud townhouse. He was unshaven, exhausted, and utterly resolute. He bypassed the maid and went directly to the library. Vivian was there, dressed in a simple dark day gown, the final letter sealed and waiting. Her expression when she saw him was one of cold, aristocratic disdain, far more punishing than any scream. "Get out, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a low, steady command. "You have your merger. I have my home. Our contract is fulfilled. You have nothing left to buy here." She gestured toward the letter on the desk. "That document contains my final assessment of your character. It is yours to read, but you will do so outside my doors." Alistair ignored the scorn. His eyes fell on the sealed envelope, and then lifted to meet her unforgiving gaze. He understood its contents immediately. "I know what that letter contains, Vivian," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I know I deserve every word of it. I came here to explain the contract, the lie that began this whole wretched affair." He stepped closer, standing over the desk, his massive frame radiating defeat and conviction. "The agreement with the Cabots was signed 2 months ago, yes, but it was not signed out of simple greed. It was signed under duress." Alistair spoke quickly, revealing the true, bitter secret of his inheritance. He explained how his empire, built on ruthlessness, was riddled with old, predatory debts and financial commitments made by his late father, commitments that had been ruthlessly exposed by powerful Eastern creditors. "I inherited an empire built on sand, Vivian," he confessed, the shame deep in his eyes. "The Cabots were the only ones who could inject the capital necessary to save thousands of jobs and my father's entire legacy from being devoured by vultures. The engagement contract was a non-negotiable term, a precondition of the rescue. I signed that document not for more wealth, but to avoid utter bankruptcy and preserve my family's name from absolute disgrace. I signed it because I was terrified, just as you were terrified of losing this house." He looked at her, his desperation laid bare. "I used you as a shield because I needed a flawless defense against the Cabot's suspicion, but the irony is this. I hated the choice I made. When I met you, the only part of the contract that became real was the crushing weight of having to betray you." Vivian listened, the cold rigidity slowly cracking under the force of his raw confession. She saw the familiar fear in his grey-blue eyes, the same terror of social ruin that she herself had battled. The lie was not born of malice, but of systemic pressure, the dark, unforgiving force of the Gilded Age itself. Alistair reached into his coat and pulled out a second large document, the signed, legally binding Cabot merger agreement. He looked at the document that represented his life's work, his ambition, and his secure future. Then he looked at Vivian, standing before him, the embodiment of his truth. He did not hesitate. With a violent, tearing sound that echoed through the quiet library, Alistair ripped the massive contract in half, then tore the pieces again, letting the fragments of his future flutter onto the floor. "There is your answer, Vivian," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. "I chose you. I chose honor. I chose the woman who taught me that my ambition was hollow. The empire is gone. I will face the ruin, the ridicule, and the inevitable litigation. I will likely leave Boston with nothing but the shirt on my back." He then reached for the letter on the desk, her scorching indictment of his character. He tore that as well, his eyes fixed fiercely on hers. "I cannot read your final judgment," he stated, his voice now a low, intense promise, "because I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it wrong. I saved your home, Vivian. You are safe, but the only safe place I know is with you. I'm a disgraced man of humble origins once again, but I am your man. I risk everything for you. Now you must choose, condemn me to ruin alone, or fight the world by my side." The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. Vivian saw not the arrogant baron, but a humbled, fierce man who had sacrificed his entire existence, his power, his security, his future, for the love she represented. He had given up the very thing he fought hardest for. He had answered her accusation with a sacrifice greater than any fortune. A single tear tracked down Vivian's cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was the absolute, devastating recognition of love. She stepped toward him, placing her hands on his cheeks, feeling the rough stubble of his unshaven face. "You risked everything," she whispered, the raw emotion in her voice trembling, "for a woman who ridiculed you." "I risked nothing," Alistair countered, his own voice cracking. "I gained the only thing of value." Their eyes locked, a profound, passionate gaze that sealed their bond. There was no need for further words, no need for a dramatic kiss. The intensity was in the devastating vulnerability, the shared ruin, and the total commitment. They were bound not by a contract of wealth, but by the reckless courage of their impossible love. The great, unforgiving world of the Gilded Age could do its worst, but they would face it together. The morning after Alistair Thorne tore up his empire, the city of Boston awoke to the most profound social and financial earthquake of 1888. The news of the scandalous dinner, the unmasking of the Vance cousin, and the immediate severing of all ties between the Cabots and the Thorne interests spread like wildfire. The Gilded Age, which prized above all else the illusion of stability, was in open chaos. For Vivian Lyons, standing in her quiet salvage library, the atmosphere was strangely peaceful. The house was safe, a truth Alistair had secured with his final, desperate act of solvency. The financial worries were replaced by a profound, terrifying hope. Alistair was gone, but his presence, his sacrifice, his vulnerability filled the room. She wore a simple dress, her hair coiled severely, her former identity restored. Yet she was no longer merely Vivian Lyons. She was the woman who had been loved fiercely enough to compel a titan to choose honor over industry. At precisely 11 o'clock, Alistair Thorne made his move. Defying the explicit advice of his last remaining solicitor, he did not flee Boston. He did not issue a retraction. Instead, he commandeered the grand, ornate ballroom of the Tremont House Hotel, a space usually reserved for major civic announcements, and summoned the press. It was an unprecedented spectacle, a financier facing utter ruin, calling a press conference. The ballroom was packed, the air thick with the acrid smoke of cigars and the nervous energy of reporters hungry for blood. Alistair stood before them, alone, his back to the towering velvet draperies. He was no longer dressed in the impeccable attire of the society suitor. He wore a severe black suit, its starkness emphasizing the chilling integrity of his purpose. His grey-blue eyes, usually sharp with calculation, now burned with a passionate, uncompromising clarity. "Gentlemen," Alistair began, his voice commanding the absolute silence of the room, "you are here expecting me to issue an apology. I will not. You are expecting me to denounce Miss Vivian Lyons as a liar and a common opportunist. I will not." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a frantic scratching of pens. Alistair planted his hands on the podium, leaning into the fire of his conviction. "The truth is this: the lie was mine. The fraud was mine. Miss Lyons was hired under false pretenses to act as my social shield, a desperate attempt to shore up an empire riddled with old debts and the sins of the past," he continued, his voice rising, shedding the last vestiges of the Brahmin tone he had attempted to cultivate. "I entered into the Cabot merger, and the engagement not for love, but for money, the very sin for which this society claims to despise me. I signed that document because I was a coward, afraid of losing the only power I knew." He paused, letting the magnitude of his confession sink in. "But in attempting to buy social acceptance, I met Miss Lyons. The woman you call a mere governess is a bluestocking of the highest honor and the finest intellect in this city. She saw the sham of the Gilded Age, and she dared to mock me. She stripped away my arrogance and exposed the truth of my character. Alistair looked directly into the mass of reporters, delivering his final, stunning declaration. I sacrificed her reputation to save my business. I will not commit that sin twice. I have unilaterally terminated the Cabot merger and the engagement. I will face the financial consequences with my head held high. And I stand here today to proclaim my deepest respect and my undying love and commitment to Miss Vivian Lyons, the only person who taught me the true meaning of value. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the intensity in his gaze daring anyone to question his choice. I will marry her, he stated with finality, and together we will defy Boston to forge an honest future. The ballroom exploded. It was a cacophony of shouting, frantic movements, and snapping flashbulbs. The greatest scandal of the decade had become the greatest, most shocking declaration of romantic commitment. At that very moment, Vivian was standing on the corner of her street, her heart pounding against her ribs. She'd heard the newsboys shouting the headline, their cries echoing down the avenues. She hadn't needed to read the paper. The sound of his deliberate, final sacrifice told her everything. He had chosen honor. He had chosen her. Vivian gathered her skirts, running past startled neighbors, her practical shoes pounding against the pavement. She ran toward the Tremont house, not caring for the propriety or the scandal, driven only by the terrifying truth that the man who loved her had just sacrificed his entire life for her honor. She burst through the rear entrance of the hotel, pushed past guards and curious onlookers, and found her way to the edge of the ballroom. She saw Alistair standing alone, besieged by reporters, his face stark with exhaustion, yet radiating a powerful, profound peace. He saw her. His eyes, the cold, calculating grey-blue eyes she had once feared, now lit with a raw, desperate joy that instantly erased the memory of his betrayal. Vivian didn't hesitate. She ran to him, the distance closing instantly. "Alistair!" she cried, the word a gasp of relief and passion. He swept her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. The force of their embrace was a physical, emotional release, a union of two souls that had faced total ruin and chosen each other. Their kiss was not tentative. It was profound and challenging, performed directly in the center of the chaotic maelstrom of the American press. It was a kiss of defiance, a public sealing of their bond, witnessed by the very society that had tried to tear them apart. It was a political act, an emotional climax, and an absolute surrender. They embraced fiercely, Alistair shielding her from the flashing lights, her hands gripping the shoulders of the man who was now financially ruined but ethically reborn. They had faced the world's judgment and chosen their truth. The scandal did not fade quickly. It became a staple of Boston lore. Alistair Thorne, the arrogant industrial baron, fell from his height, his assets ravaged by the Cabot's revenge and the subsequent lawsuits. But he was not truly ruined. He was reborn. Vivian and Alistair settled into her quiet, salvaged townhouse, the home saved by Alistair's final act of selfless foresight. The place that had been a cage of desperation for Vivian and the setting of their dangerous charade became their sanctuary. The subsequent years were not easy, but they were rich. They faced the financial struggle together, bound by a profound, practical partnership. Vivian's intellect, once a mere tool for mockery, became the foundation of their new ventures. She proved to be his most astute advisor, directing his ambition away from the saturated markets of steel and rail and toward the nascent, untapped potential of new technology, perhaps the emerging science of electricity or the burgeoning telephone industry. Alistair built his second, smaller but infinitely more robust empire on a foundation of honesty and shared integrity. Their love, forged in the intense heat of deception and tested by utter ruin, resisted the erosion of time by transforming into a deep, unwavering camaraderie. The initial, volatile passion matured into a quiet, comfortable devotion, the secure knowledge that they were the only two people who truly knew and accepted one another's worst truths. They had two children, a boy and a girl, raised with the dignity of Vivian's lineage and the innovative vision of Alistair's hard-won success. Their children inherited the mother's sharp mind and the father's unflinching honesty, representing the perfect, successful union of Boston's old-world integrity and the new world's progress. As for the antagonists, the Gilded Age exacted its price. The Cabots retained their social standing, but lost crucial capital, and were forever tainted by the public shame of the Governess scandal. Mr. Harrington, though he secured vast sums by capitalizing on Alistair's near bankruptcy, never escaped the social stigma. He was known as Harrington the Vulture, the financier who had sacrificed decency for profit. He won wealth, but lost all measure of gentlemanly respect, becoming a social outcast whose cold ambition eventually isolated him entirely. Vivian and Alistair, however, won the true prize. 20 years after the great scandal, in the library of their home, the very room where Alistair first knelt before the proud Bluestocking. The room is now warmed by a deep, rich patina of time and use. The heavy mahogany desk is scattered with new patents and old poetry. Alistair, now 53, his dark hair silvered at the temples, sits by the fire reading a financial report. Vivian, 48, her figure still slender, her brown eyes still burning with fierce intelligence, is reviewing documents related to their daughter's recent engagement. The Cabot girl, Vivian muses, setting the papers down. Imagine the irony, Alistair. Our daughter marries into a family that once tried to ruin us. Alistair looks up, his grey-blue eyes crinkling at the corners. He rises and walks toward her, the years of shared struggle having replaced his former rigidity with a gentle, powerful ease. The difference, Alistair says, his deep voice carrying the familiar resonance of authority, is that she goes to them with her honesty intact, not as a commodity to be purchased. We taught her the only lesson that matters, Vivian. Money is a tool, but integrity is the only inheritance. He moves behind her heavy leather armchair, his large, powerful hands settling on her shoulders, kneading away the subtle tension. It is a gesture of profound, comfortable ownership. We were a spectacular risk, weren't we? Vivian whispers, leaning back into his familiar warmth. The disgraced Baron and the mocking Governess. We should have been ruined completely. Alistair bends down, pressing a tender, nostalgic kiss to the side of her neck, right where he had once left the burning mark of his desire in the conservatory. I risked everything, my love, and I won, he murmurs, his voice thick with the devotion of 2 decades. He slides his hands down, resting them over her heart. I may have lost the First Empire, but you showed me the true meaning of value, and for that I will never stop paying my devotion. They sit together in the quiet sanctuary of the home they saved, surrounded by the books that ignited their war and the love that forged their peace. They had not bowed to the Gilded Age. They had conquered it, creating a private, enduring triumph that was more magnificent than any fortune. And so, we close the book on Alistair Thorne and Vivian Lyons, whose passionate, reckless journey through the glittering, unforgiving landscape of the Gilded Age ended not in ruin, but in triumph. Their story is a powerful reminder that honor is the ultimate currency. Alistair, the Titan who believed he could buy his way to respect, found his true fortune only when he risked losing everything, his power, his security, and his wealth, to protect the woman he loved. He learned that the only empire worth building is one based on integrity. And Vivian, the courageous Bluestocking who used her intellect as a shield against a cruel world, discovered that true strength lies not in scorn, but in vulnerability and forgiveness. She refused to let betrayal define her. Instead, she used her wisdom to redefine her destiny. Their triumph wasn't just about finding love, it was about winning on their own terms. They taught us that when you choose truth over convenience and choose love over fear, you can defy the rigid expectations of any era. They built a legacy that was richer and more meaningful than the fleeting gold of their time. We hope you were captivated by the drama of their clandestine lessons, the thrill of their forbidden passion, and the emotional force of their final, public defiance. What was the most unforgettable moment for you? Did Alistair's grand sacrifice, Seven, redeem him in your eyes, or was Vivian's courage, Eight, the true hero of this romance? Tell us in the comments below. We love reading your thoughts and seeing what parts of the story resonated with you most deeply. And if you stayed until the very end, thank you. To help spread the word and let us know who made it through the entire journey, please type the word blanket in the comments. Your engagement truly helps us share more of these intense, dramatic, Gilded Age romances. Until the next story, remember, dare to mock the man of fortune, but dare even more to love him honestly.